Can you hear me now? Is that loud enough? Okay. Well, welcome everybody on this beautiful day. We couldn't have asked for a better one, and it's a good thing because we didn't have a rain date. Um, I'm Barry Griffith. I'm a member of the Crown Point Road Association. And to quote our book, we are an organization devoted to promoting interest in the Crown Point Road and preserving all information and historical materials relating to it. And we do other things like getting involved in the relocation and the rededication of monuments, like we're doing today. So this is a special occasion for us. You may ask, what is the Crown Point Road, and why do we bother to promote it? Why does it make a difference? Let's start with what is it. If you look at the marker, it says Crown Point Road, built by General Amherst, 1759. So that's, I guess, the starting point. That was during the French and Indian War. In the years before that, the French had worked their way up the St. Lawrence River and into Lake Champlain and had a couple of forts. Fort St. Frederick was at what we now call Crown Point, and then there was a French fort further down the way, Carillon, where we now call Ticonderoga. And in 1759, the British forces under General Amherst managed to, with 10,000 troops, march their way up into Lake Champlain, and the French decided it was time to retreat back to Montreal. So the British captured that point and promptly renamed it Crown Point in honor of the Crown. And Amherst at that point decided he was going to build a fort there, Fort Crown Point, and then attack Canada the following year, the French forces there. And he ordered a road to be built from that spot across from Chimney Point over to Fort Number 4, which was on the Connecticut River in Charleston, New Hampshire. And so a road was built at his direction. Now, the road builders could have chosen any number of ways to go. Here locally, they could have chosen to go over the Otter Creek here in this town at what they called Pitt's Ford, which was a wonderful way to cross if you were on foot, named by the British for William Pitt, who was the Secretary of State during the French and Indian War. But instead, the forces decided to stay on this side of Otter Creek all the way down another 15 or 20 miles until they got to Clarendon, where they built some bridges, a bridge, and then finished the route to Number 4. So it was. The road was initially used as a military road, and in 1759, a couple of important things happened. Number one, when at the end of the campaign, Amherst sent his forces, who were from southeastern New England, Boston, Rhode Island, and places like that, New Hampshire, back to their homes using the Crown Point Road, which shortened the trip considerably. And then, no less importantly, the road was used to bring cattle, nourishment, up to Crown Point, where the fort was and where the troops were going to muster to invade Canada the following year. And it is written that in 1759 there were 5 droves of cattle that came up from Boston over the Crown Point Road, about 80 herds, 80 head each, so there was about 400 cattle that came up over the Crown Point Road, and that was probably just as important as getting the troops home. And then in 1770, the troops came back from New Hampshire to Crown Point as predicted. Amherst was able to get the French invade Canada, get the French to surrender. And so the war was over, and the use of the road as a military road was over. But what followed was essentially 15 years of peace from, let's say, and in those 15 years, 1760 to 1775, settlers began coming into Vermont from places south, places like Connecticut, Massachusetts, over from New Hampshire. And many of those original settlers of our Vermont towns used the Crown Point Road to get here and then to communicate with each other over the years that followed. So the importance of the road in addition to being a military road for a couple of years, is that it really allowed many of our early settlers here in Vermont to come here and settle here. I mentioned 1775. That was the beginning of the American Revolution. At that point, as you probably remember, on May 10th, just a couple of days away, the anniversary, Ethan Allen surprised the British on Lake Champlain, took over Fort Ticonderoga. The British abandoned Ticonderoga and Crown Point and headed north. And the American forces used the road again during the American Revolution to get troops back and forth to the lake for that conflict. And that I think, and that was why it became a particular interest to the Daughters of the American Revolution, because it was a road used during the American Revolution. The first DAR marker was placed along the road 120 years ago. 1903, it was placed by the Ann Story chapter of the DAR, based in Rutland, and many of its members are here today, to mark the site of Fort Ranger. And over the years, I haven't counted how many, 40, 50 markers were placed by the DAR over the road. Right here, the marker we're talking about today was placed by the Lake Dunmore chapter, which was based in Brandon, and it set this marker up and two others as well on June 14th of 1911, more than 100 years ago. So with that introduction, what I would like to do is turn the microphone over to Catherine Brodeur Johnson, who is the Vermont State Regent for the DAR, and she has a few words to say. Kat.
Yeah, your glasses fell right there. There you go. So I am, as Barry just said, the Vermont State Society Daughters of the American Revolution State Regent. Vermont DAR has 13 chapters with 509 members. We are small, but we are mighty. As Barry has said, the Lake Dunmore chapter, named after Lake Dunmore, which was a scene of the exploits of the Green Mountain Boys during the Revolutionary War, was organized by our state regent, Mrs. Cornelia Burdett, on January 22nd. I should probably have grabbed my readers. 1896. I write it and then I forget what I wrote. There we go. Not really right now. Mrs. Helen P. Harris was the chapter regent from 1910 to 1913. She was born in Pittsford in 1843 and died in her home in Brandon in 1919. She was the regent when this marker was originally placed and would have conducted the ceremony. In 1911, Lake Dunmore chapter placed 6 Crown Point markers. I found that. 1 in Pittsford, 2 in Brandon, and 3 in Sudbury. By 1931, according to our DAR histories, various DAR chapters placed 42 markers for the Crown Point Road. Unfortunately, Lake Dunmore chapter did disband in 2018, but they had a long run. There's more history on the Lake Dunmore chapter, but not to bore you too much. I'm kind of a short, sweet, and to the point when I go to talk. However, on a side note, and it's a small world and funny how that things happen. When I was the Vermont CIR, Children of the American Revolution state president, one of my projects was to clean a section of the Crown Point Road. I unfortunately don't remember which one, and I did not dig through my piles of paperwork, but I recall it being a hot August day, and it would have been in 1996, and we cleaned around a marker and a little bit of the trail leading up to and beyond. So it's a small world, and funny how things happen in the cycle of life. So thank you for allowing me to speak.
Thank you, Kat. So we've talked a little bit about the road and a little bit about the DAR and its involvement with the markers, and thank you for those facts and figures. We're here for a rededication ceremony, and that raises the question, why? Why are we here? Why was the marker somewhere else? And that's a long story. It can be a long story, and we're lucky here to have the Pittsford Historical Society president Bill Powers, who's a great historian and knows a great deal about this, and in fact was very involved with the relocation. So, Bill, let's come up and tell people about that.
Usually people clap after the presentation is over. All right, well, thanks for that more distinctive presentation. Well, I'm here to talk about the relocation of the monument. Uh, yeah, okay, how's this? Is this better? My hand shake, but you're going to have to excuse me. This hand shakes and shakes worse than usual because I suffered a concussion in my head here a little over a year ago. So it's also affected my recall. So if somebody knows that I'm telling you something that didn't happen, please remind me and I'll correct it. But I think it was 2 years ago, there was some electrical work being done on Depot Hill Road here in Pittsford, and it was right near where this marker was, and it was in the way. And at that time, I was president of Pittsford Historical Society, and I said, well, why don't you just dig it up and put it behind the Pittsford Historical Society? So it was dug up, and I believe, Josh, you're hiding behind that pillar over there. I saw you. So I think you're the guy that moved it, right? You moved it to Pittsford. No, don't go away because we're going to get back to you. Yeah, no, you're not done. So, so it sat over there behind the Pittsford Historical Society for some time, and then where's Jim Rowe? Did he go away and hide? No, he's right here. So, but that marker weighs 1,200 pounds, and it was also encased in a significant amount of concrete. So we decided that maybe the concrete should be removed, and so we could replant the marker somewhere. So I contacted Jim Rowe, and lives up in Huntington, and he stopped by my son's house, who happens to have a jackhammer, and he lives up in where does he live? Heinsberg. Thank you. So Jim and I met behind the Pittsford Historical Society. He jackhammered all the concrete off of it and took it away, and so that's where that monument has been resting up until last year. And Josh Town was kind enough to come over and pick that monument up, put it under his arm, carried it over here, and planted it where it is now. And this was with the advice and consent of the Crown Point Road Association. We've agreed that this is closer to where the Crown Point Road actually went. In fact, it lines up very well with the marker at the Gorham Bridge and the road up north here, the Hollister Quarry Road. It is also agrees with St. Caverly, who he's known as so in Pittsford because he wrote the history of Pittsford and published it in 1872. He also established what was known as the Caverly Preventorium or Sanatorium here back at about that same time to take care of lung diseases. But anyhow, when Caverly wrote his book, he did a tremendous amount of research. And if anybody reads the 1872 version and probably the republished one later on, by his footnotes and everything else, he did deed research. He researched the holdings of the Vermont Historical Society. But the most memorable thing that he did, he sent out a questionnaire to all the people here in Pittsford and surrounding area, I guess, on what they knew and what their story was regarding the Pittsford area. So all those questionnaires came in, and then he wrote his history of Pittsford. And by the way, those responses to those queries are now within the archives of the Pittsburgh Historical Society. So if you're into genealogical research or that type of stuff, we have firsthand accounts of people telling their stories in the 1860s. Well, in that history of Pittsburgh, Cavally addresses the Crown Point Road. And he says that when the Crown Point Road came through Pittsburgh, it was just a little bit east of Abel Morgan's house. And Abel Morgan's house still stands right here. It belongs to Josh Town and Liz Willis. And he said that there was a depression in the ground where Samuel Waters had a tavern, and that tavern was probably between us and the house. And so if he's building that, Samuel Waters came here in about, well, he had to be here in the late, after the French and Indian War, but he was here, we know, in 1774, because there's an account of he had a tavern here. And we know towards the south end of the Whipple Hollow Road, we had the Selden family that was there prior to the Revolutionary War. So we had a thoroughfare here, currently called the Whipple Hollow Road, crossing the Crown Point Road. So that someday you could stop here at a tavern and get a snort and head north or south wherever you're going. So now, why was the original marker placed on Depot Hill Road? Now, during the time that the DAR was doing their wonderful work, if I remember an account correctly, the DAR purchased 10 markers, excuse me, and placed them accordingly. And one of the people may have influenced that, this is speculation on my part, was Douglas Bates, who was a resident of Pittsburgh and lived on Corn Hill Road, which is where the Pittsburgh Proctor golf course is. And that turns into as it heads south towards Rutland, turned into Grove Street, which goes into Rutland now. And he seems to have influenced where the marker went. And certainly after the Crown Point Road came through here, this opened the country for people to come and emigrate. So you got the French and Indian War, 1759, 1760. You've got Pittsburgh became an entity because of the crossing at the Otter Creek here. And if you've been here on previous versions of the Crown Point tours, we have visited the crossing, which gave the name to Pittsburgh. And so, for some reason, as things evolved, it appears that maybe the Crown Point Road had been identified as coming up Grove Street in Rutland and then up Corn Hill Road and coming here. But so we have moved the monument. Physically, Josh Town did a great job of picking that sucker up and moving it back here and planting it where it is today. And I think he deserves a round of applause for that. So, good. Now that I've embarrassed you enough, Josh, you can go home where you want. But we really appreciate it. And if you think about the Crown Point Road coming up through the notch there, going up here behind it was talked about Abel Morgan's house, and going up across the Hollister Quarry Road and ultimately through Brandon and on to Crown Point. So that's why the monument is here. Samuel Waters, who was the original settler here, took off here just before the Revolutionary War and moved to Shaftesbury, Vermont, which is just north of Bennington. and he died there in 1786. So we still haven't pinpointed exactly where his tavern is, but maybe in the future we can get some historical marker put there. But that would be after the Crown Point Road. But my point is that this was an intersection, not only by the Crown Point Road, but a few years later with the Whipple Hollow Road. So, and with a tavern here, it must have been something to see at that time. So that's basically my take. I'm willing to entertain any questions you may have.
So what was the year that the tavern is thought to have been built? And part B, what year was the tavern thought to be built? And also, what year they think Whipple Hollow connected south up through the north here?
Yeah, okay. The date that I have seen specifically attributed to the tavern is 1774. And we use Caverly's account of it because he seems to have done most of the research closer to the event of the Crown Point Road and the Revolutionary War. And he's pretty good, and particularly when you understand the amount of research he did and the amount of people who were still living in the 17 or 1860s. We know that the Whipple Hollow Road existed because if you go down to, you're almost to the West Rutland Pittsford town line. There was an area called Sargentsville, but that, we're talking the middle of the 1800s now. And there's an account of Gideon Sheldon and his family living down to right near the borderline between Pittsford and West Rutland. And we know they were there by the Revolutionary War because he had two children who were captured by the Indians and the British and taken north to Canada, where one of the sons died and the son, also a Gideon, finally returned. So we know that in the 1760, 1770 time frame that these roads that I just mentioned were in existence.
Just on the other side of our Pittsford Bridge, someone can correct me if I'm wrong. I think there was another tavern to the south, which when the rebels were escaping over Pittsford Bridge from the Battle of Hubbardton, some went to the tavern. Would that be the cell?
Not that I know of. There may have been a tavern, but I think any tavern would have been south because there's no reason to come north. Because if you go,
That was Mead's Tavern down in Rutland, probably.
yeah, that's good point. So yeah, and is there anything else? Is that it? I thought somebody fine. Okay, thank you.
Bill, thank you. One of the reasons I like the Crown Point Road Association so much is that we hold ceremonies, we do research, but we also do hiking. If you look at our logo in the program, it says "Hike Through History," and one of the things the Crown Point Road Association does every year is tries in the months from May through November to hold a hike, an outing every month at some place either directly on the Crown Point Road or in some of the offshoots around the Crown Point Road. As it just so happens, in 2 weeks, we're going to be back here in Pittsford to do an outing along some of that stretch that Bill Powers was talking about. And Jim Rose, our historian, is going to lead that hike. So while we have a captive audience here, I thought I'd have Jim tell you a little bit about that and invite you back in 2 weeks. Jim.
So yeah, on May 20th at 11 a.m., we're going to meet at the Pittsford Historical Society building and try to replicate reasonably accurately the May 4th, 1958 car tour slash hike that the newly formed Crown Point Road Association did. I'll just mention that the Crown Point Road Association was formed in the very late 1950s, just in time to recognize the 200th anniversary of the construction of the Crown Point Road. And a lot of the forming of the Crown Point Road Association came from a man named Joseph Wheeler, who was doing a massive amount of research on the Mount Independence Hubbardton Road. And he was just finding so much information on the Crown Point Road that he didn't want to focus on the Crown Point Road. He encouraged others to take that on, which they did. And I was fortunate to have known many of the early founding members of the Crown Point Road Association. So now the Crown Point Road Association has taken on the responsibility of the Mount Independence Hubbardton Road also, which we do some hikes and some tours on. So with that, hopefully you can show up on the 20th of May, and we'll see what we can find for this next tour. Thank you.
And if you want to find out more about our hikes, I don't know that we have the hike schedules here, but if you Google Crown Point Road, you'll find our association website, and actually Dale is handing up. We do have some magnets with the you can put on your refrigerator that will remind you of all the hikes in 2023. Julia, do I see your hand up?
As I was driving here and I got onto Whipple Hollow Road in West Rutland, I noticed a sign about the Hubbardton Military Road. It's a brown sign on the left-hand side as you're coming up this way. What is that?
Jim, you want to speak to that?
So the Mount Independence Hubbardton Military Road, as we know, ran from the south end of Mount Independence, and it came down to center Rutland where there was Fort Ranger. They did build a bridge across Otter Creek. So down in that area, you had the 1772 Skeensboro Rutland Road, Skeensboro being today's Whitehall. So you had that road running east and west, and then you had the Mount Independence Hubbardton Road coming in from basically the northwest down, and then the Crown Point Road coming up through there running north and south. So it's quite a historic spot right there. And where that sign is, that's where St. Clair supposedly stopped after the Battle of Hubbardton happened and kind of did a little report there. Maybe in the future.
Yeah, we do rely on landowner cooperation for our hikes. We've been very lucky, and again, having Josh here and Liz Willis, they've been super cooperative here for us, our celebration here today. I thought what we would do to conclude this, some of you have been to the marker ahead of this ceremony, some of you haven't. We have two nice new American flags, and I thought we could conclude the ceremony and the rededication by bringing a couple of flags over, and perhaps, Catherine, if you on behalf of the DAR would like to plant one of those flags, and Bill, either you or some designee from the Pittsford Historical Society perhaps can bring one over, and we'll conclude the ceremony by planting those flags. And after that, we had thought about doing a reception afterwards, but it's such a lovely day, we think we're going to let you go on your way. And thank you very much for coming, and I hope you've enjoyed it.